In the grand tapestry of American history, a singular name emerges, embodying a symphony of applause and contradictions: Malcolm Little, a name etched in the crucible of racial conflicts. He embarked on a metamorphic odyssey that would redefine not only his own identity, but also the very contours of political activism. Born in the shadowy tones of a segregated nation, raised without a father, shuffled through foster homes, and lost in a life of drugs and crime, the prison cells would lead him on a profound spiritual journey and a change of identity. A change that also reflected the same search for redemption by the American nation. His voice reverberated throughout the country with a political, ethnic, and religious message. Pursued by the FBI, closely watched by the KGB, admired by leaders like Gamal Abdel Nasser and Che Guevara. Today we'll explore the story of Malcolm X. This is Reynaldo Carrillo speaking. This is the new Encyclopedia, and you can support our channel simply by liking this video, leaving a comment, sharing it with your friends, and supporting us on Patreon, which you can find below in the comments. Born against the sepia backdrop of Omaha, Nebraska on May 19, 1925. His family tree traced his roots back to the Great Migration, a period when millions of African Americans moved from the southern United States to the rest of the country. The youngest of 7 children, his upbringing was shaped by a mix of perseverance and adversity. His father, named Earl Little, was an important and charismatic Baptist preacher and a fervent advocate for African American self-determination. He was a man who instilled in young Malcolm a powerful sense of identity and purpose. His mother, Louise, was a mulatto woman from Grenada, born after being abused by a Scottish man. She was a devoted, educated woman who, together with her husband, followed the teachings of the Pan-Africanist leader Earl Garvey, who proposed that all people of African descent in the United States and in the Caribbean colonies should leave their lands to return to Africa. But the truth is that Malcolm Little was different from the black people he sought to identify with. He had green eyes, his nose was not very wide, he had reddish touches, freckles, and his skin was lighter than the others. He inherited the mixed-race features of his mother. The legacy of his parents, who tried to give him and his siblings a relatively peaceful life, was overshadowed by tragedy. Malcolm's father was brutally murdered in the context of the racial conflicts of the time. In addition to this, the now-deceased father, Earl Little, had an insurance policy whose agent refused to pay his widow, arguing that he had killed himself, when in reality he had been struck on the head with a hammer and thrown onto the tracks of a streetcar to be run over. To pay the bills, Mrs. Lewis tends the garden and makes her children fend for themselves however they can, even by hunting animals. Segregation policies remained in effect, posing greater limitations for single mothers. The Little family was harassed by members of the Ku Klux Klan on multiple occasions and were displaced by the racial conflicts of that time. So the Little family emigrated to Michigan in search of refuge, but hostility struck them twice again. First, the family's house was consumed by flames, and then Malcolm's mother, Louise Little, became pregnant by a man who abandoned her. She suffered a nervous breakdown and was admitted to a psychiatric hospital. With his mother hospitalized and declared by social services as incapable of raising her children, they were sent to different foster homes under the care of the state. Malcolm spent time in multiple orphanages and attended a school as the sole dark-skinned student. Similarly, he fit in with several classmates and developed a cheerful, talkative, and friendly character despite the adversities. And at some point in his education, he was elected class representative. In high school, he expressed his desire to study law. This was very uncommon for an Afro-descendant in those states and was not received with optimism by the members of his school. So Malcolm Little drops out of school at the age of 14, and for the next 7 years he bounces around between Lansing and Flynn in Michigan. He goes from working at a railroad company where he steals tools to sell them on the black market to having occasional stays in the Roxbury neighborhood in Boston, where he prostitutes himself for money with some men. It is during that time that the life of crime, sex, drugs, smuggling, and pimping all mix together, and eventually he is arrested multiple times without serving any sentence because the police would beat him up and then leave him in some alley. When the draft tries to conscript him during World War II, Malcolm pretends to be mentally ill, saying that he wanted to join the army not to fight the enemy, but to get rid of the white people who promoted segregation in the southern United States. So he is declared mentally unfit for service and continues a life of crime. At the end of 1945, he returns to Roxbury, where he joins a gang that robbed apartments in white or wealthy neighborhoods, trying to pawn a watch. He is arrested by the authorities and given an 8-year sentence to serve in the Charleston State Prison. And 2 years later, he is transferred to the Norfolk Penal Colony. At the Norfolk Penal Colony, the prison regime was notoriously different from that of other prisons. They were more focused on rehabilitation for reintegration than on punishing the inmates, so they granted them more freedoms. They were allowed to study and had access to a library with the possibility of technical studies. In that prison, he meets John Bembry, a fellow inmate who instills in him the habit of reading. Malcolm begins to become an avid reader and also starts receiving letters from his siblings, who tell him about an emerging identity movement, heterodox in religion and focused on black nationalism, called the Nation of Islam. His brother Reginald, who had joined the Nation of Islam, writes to him asking him to become familiar with the teachings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, the name of the leader of this Islamic sect. The Nation of Islam said, to seek to revive the spiritual, mental, social, and economic consciousness of the African American population within the precepts of Islam. However, this cult had several differences from traditional Islam. They had a polytheistic view of Allah and believed that the African race was meant to be the highest within the social order. They did not seek integration between different ethnic groups, but rather that African Americans could return to their lands to live in community without the influence of white people. Malcolm follows his brother's advice and approaches this religion. He is very attracted to it, begins to distance himself from vices, and starts exchanging correspondence with its leader, Elijah Muhammad, starting in the summer of 1948. And in his letters, Elijah Muhammad slowly convinces him to renounce his past, recognize the evil of the white man, and convert to Islam to find his redemption. Elijah also quickly develops an affinity with Malcolm, noticing the intelligence and energy in the young prisoner's letters. Radicalized by the Nation of Islam, Malcolm was navigating through an intricate maze of broken dreams, floating in his past, of hopes he held on to, and of recovering a new faith. In the very heart of this prison, he found a boiling cauldron of conflicting emotions, where rage and redemption clashed in a whirlwind of feelings. Every trial he underwent was something that would ultimately shape, through his transformation, a resilient and robust spirit that would become the foundation of his future destiny. Following the custom of Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm embraces X as his new name, a symbol that meant breaking the chains that the Nation of Islam considered present in Anglo-Saxon surnames as a legacy of enslavement. He said, quote, "For me, the X replaces the surname of the white master Little, which some blue-eyed devil named Little imposed on my paternal ancestors," end quote. This transformation was about to touch the hearts and minds of an entire restless generation that was about to hear his message. Malcolm X is granted parole and is released from prison on August 7, 1952. He immediately goes to Chicago and meets with Elijah Muhammad, who promotes him as a role model for the Nation of Islam. From a criminal to a renewed man and religious preacher, Malcolm begins to develop with great vigor and skill in his speech and his ability to connect with listeners. Muhammad assigns him the administration of Mosque No. 1 in Detroit, and later he founds Mosque No. 11 in Boston. In March of 1954, he founds Mosque No. 12 in Philadelphia, and then goes on to lead Mosque No. 7 in Harlem, in which he becomes more popular, attracting a large number of members. But as he gains notoriety by 1953, the Federal Bureau of Investigation under J. Edgar Hoover, through the Counterintelligence Program, opens a file on Malcolm X. They begin to follow him and intercept his correspondence and phone calls, since they notice that the young Malcolm is becoming even more popular than the founder of the sect himself, Elijah Muhammad, whose entourage was already infiltrated through his eldest son's assistance. Malcolm was an eloquent man with an impressive physical presence, standing nearly 2 meters tall, which overshadowed the diminutive Elijah Muhammad. Attractive to women, Malcolm falls in love with Betty Sanders in 1955 after a rally. He convinces her to convert to Islam, and she changes her name to Betty X. Together, they had 6 daughters. His influence as a leader and recruiter in the Nation of Islam made the movement become widely known. He participated in radio programs, gave interviews, and became a national figure. And he began to overshadow the leadership of Elijah Muhammad, even though he publicly said that he owed his status, his position, and his influence to Elijah. It's none other than Malcolm X, after being invited by the then heavyweight boxer Cassius Clay on a visit to his gym in Miami. He is the one who convinces the boxer to join the Nation of Islam and change his name to Muhammad Ali. The members of the Nation of Islam believed that white people were like devils or Satans. Part of their mythology behind this conclusion was that the white race, the so-called race of demons, had been created by ancestral black scientists in an experiment started by a man named Yaqub about 6,600 years ago. Eventually, according to this mythology, there would be a world war or Armageddon in which Africans would defeat the white demons, and the black race would once again have the first place in the social hierarchy. It was believed that the founder of the Nation of Islam, named Wallace D. Fard, was the human incarnation of Allah, and that Elijah Muhammad was his divine messenger. By the late 1950s, Malcolm X changed his name again to Al-Haj Malik al-Shabazz. He received privileges from the Nation of Islam network that Elijah Muhammad did not even extend to his own children. His own house, a vehicle in his name, and a group of bodyguards. In September 1960, he was invited to United Nations General Assembly meetings by leaders of several African nations, like Gamal Abdel Nasser, or from Latin American countries like Fidel Castro. Malcolm's charisma had already made him a national and international spokesperson during a restless and vigorous era, which embraced new struggles and human conflicts. He amassed a great ability to rally those who followed him, inspired by his words, while for others he was an enigma that no one could control and therefore dangerous. Malcolm's rhetoric becomes even more radical when he sees the passivity of the so-called civil rights movement. He criticizes the leadership of Martin Luther King, even calling him a monkey. He also speaks with disdain about the famous March of Black People on Washington in 1963, calling it a farce, and he said, quote, that he didn't know why. Why did black people get so excited about a demonstration led by white people in front of a statue of a president who had been dead for 100 years? And who didn't like us when he was alive, end quote. He also calls John Kennedy a hypocrite in his civil rights agenda and advocates for total segregation between whites and blacks, that the latter should return to Africa, that they should organize themselves into an armed self-defense movement, and that nonviolence was useless since blacks should advance their agenda by any means possible. Malcolm X also accuses Jews of being the creators of slavery in Europe, of having monopolized trade, and of promoting cultural vices in African communities, even trivializing the events that took place in Central Europe between 1939 and 1945, and even sympathizing with the ideas of some European ethno-nationalist leaders in the sense that each one was seeking the best for their own ethnic group. Several historical events led to Malcolm X having several disagreements with Elijah Muhammad. On one hand, Muhammad's passivity in the face of police abuses in Los Angeles in 1962 against the African American community greatly upset Malcolm X. On the other hand, there were many scandals surrounding the leader of the Nation of Islam. Malcolm talks with Elijah Muhammad's son, named Wallace, who had been anointed at birth as the successor to the leader of the Nation of Islam. And Wallace confirms to him that indeed Muhammad had fathered several children with young secretaries, and that moreover he had denied paternity, and he had expelled several of these young women from the nation for having had sexual relations before marriage. Even more shocking, within that cult, Wallace tells Malcolm that he doubted his father's divinity. As a minister, Malcolm had always faithfully reported to the messenger, as they called Muhammad, every development related to the Nation of Islam. So, shortly after the meeting, he confronts Elijah Muhammad about his adultery. According to FBI recording reports, Muhammad compared himself to the David of the Bible and to Noah and Lot, biblical figures associated with adultery. Muhammad said, "I have to fulfill all these things." But after this meeting, Malcolm continued talking about Muhammad's moral failings with his associates. And so it was, becoming a threat to the status quo of the Nation of Islam, of Elijah Muhammad and his family. The last straw occurs after John F. Kennedy's assassination. Elijah Muhammad asks the leadership of the Nation of Islam to observe mourning for the assassination. But when Malcolm X is asked for his opinion, he says that the chickens have come home to roost, implying that Kennedy's political mistakes led to his death. In response to this, Elijah Muhammad becomes furious and finally decides to strip Malcolm X of all his privileges and positions. He removes him from his position at the mosque, revokes his monthly stipend, and tries to evict him from the house, which belonged to the Nation of Islam and where he lived with his family. And he forbids him from speaking in public for 90 days. He also sends an order to the newspaper of this Muslim sect to reduce coverage of Malcolm. Thugs from other mosques begin to harass Malcolm and Betty with death threats, phone calls at all hours of the night, and lurking near Malcolm's meetings in attempts to intimidate. Malcolm had been the national spokesperson for the Nation of Islam and had become famous as a fierce and eloquent advocate of black nationalism. But being in the inner circle of the head of the Nation of Islam, he had come to see his leader as a charlatan and had grown skeptical of his teachings. Among them, the one that all white people were blue-eyed devils. This begins a conflict between Malcolm X and several of the authorities of the Nation of Islam. Elijah Muhammad publicly asked that there be no retaliation against Malcolm X. But the informants that the FBI had infiltrated in the West Sequito report that Elijah Muhammad's sons were planning to attempt on his life. Meanwhile, Muhammad was growing impatient with Malcolm. After finally leaving the Nation of Islam, Malcolm goes through another intense period of reform. He makes a pilgrimage to Mecca to learn about Islam firsthand and adopts the traditional Sunni teachings of the Muslim religion. More convinced now, he sends letters denouncing Muhammad as a false religious leader. Quote, "I will never rest until I undo the harm I did to so many well-intentioned and innocent black people who now believe in him even more fanatically and blindly than I did." End quote. He becomes critical of the diminished role of women in the nation, renounces black supremacism, and begins to believe that an interracial coalition could work together to fight against a wide range of evils. Those he considered to be racism, colonialism, and capitalism. After this, Malcolm X founded his own organization, the Organization of Afro-American Unity, advocating for Pan-Africanism. He meets with Martin Luther King Jr., marches with him from Selma to Montgomery, and offers him his apologies. He attends the Senate debate in Washington on the Civil Rights Act of 1965. And that same year, he visits Cairo, mingles with Gamal Abdel Nasser, and travels through Ethiopia, Nigeria, Guinea, Sudan, Senegal, Libya, Algeria, and Morocco. In addition to the Organization of Afro-American Unity, Malcolm had founded the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, a group that would allow his followers to explore more orthodox versions of Sunni Islam. Throughout 1965, the FBI also approaches him to provide information about Elijah Muhammad. And how did he use the Nation of Islam as a network of stores, mosques, and apartments to evade taxes? But Malcolm refuses to give information. The FBI warns him that the Nation of Islam intends to attempt on his life. And Malcolm responds that he knows it, but that he will do nothing to cooperate with the justice system of the United States. Malcolm X's car was set on fire, and his wife received constant threats over the phone. On February 14th, members of Mosque Number 25, led by Elijah Muhammad's son, set fire to the house they had tried to take from Malcolm, with him and his family inside. But Malcolm and his family managed to escape 7 days after their house was set on fire. Knowing about the threats and warnings, Malcolm X decides to give a speech, On February 21, 1965, at the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem, to launch his Organization of Afro-American Unity. At 39 years old, he wore a dark suit and a new beard, and he was in a process of reinvention. In this auditorium, 400 people entered the hall. Betty Chabaz, the wife of Malcolm, who was pregnant with twins, pushed her way to a bench, with her 4 little daughters neatly groomed. Malcolm walks to the center of the stage and shuffles some notes in his hand. "Assalamu alaikum," he says hoarsely. Suddenly, 4 rows back, 2 men start to struggle, one shouting, "Get your hands out of my pocket." Then, near the back, a man lights a homemade smoke bomb and throws it underneath. The device crackles on the floor, releases a thick smoke, and panic breaks out. Malcolm's escort goes to see what was happening and leaves him exposed. Malcolm moves to restore order, stepping out from behind the podium with his arms raised, asking for calm. In an instant, William Bradley, a member of the Newark Mosque of the Nation of Islam, charges toward the stage. He points a sawed-off shotgun at Malcolm's chest and pulls the trigger. The main buckshot pierces Malcolm's aorta, and 2 other men pull out their pistols and run toward the stage to finish off his fallen body. His death was complete. In the wake of Malcolm's death, the world rushes to make sense of this tragic end. The media's portrayal swung between villainy and martyrdom, echoing the polarized nature of his life. From a life of crime to black religious supremacy, and then to traditional Islam and political secularism. Malcolm X, the enigmatic advocate for justice and equality, transcends his earthly form to become a symbol for different movements. The search for justice for the death of Malcolm X was hindered by the very institutions he always denounced. The police and judicial work imprisoned 2 people who were not guilty. Government agencies, with their shady informants and clandestine operations, sowed confusion and doubt along the way regarding the case. The judicial proceedings that followed left many questions unanswered and the truth obscured by layers of intrigue. And so, as the curtain of history falls on this enigmatic figure, the name Malcolm X stands not simply as an appellation, but as a resounding testament to the transformative power of the word. His life was a confluence of ice and fire, a tapestry that shone with the hues of both personal and collective redemption. His words marked a restless generation, one that was discovering a new world and believed it was fighting for a better society. This is Reynaldo Carrillo speaking to you, and this is the new Encyclopedia. And thank you all very much for sharing our videos, for leaving your comments, for following us on our Instagram, and for supporting us on Patreon, which you can find below this video. Until next time, and may God bless you.